There's been a heartbreaking update in the case of missing 4-year-old Javeayah Harris from Aiken, South Carolina. Javeayah was reported missing by her parents on June 30th, sparking a massive 5,000-acre search. But over the weekend, this case has took a tragic turn. Law enforcement held a press conference and they revealed a disturbing detail. They said that Javeayah is presumed dead, and according to the sheriff, she didn't wander off in her Minnie Mouse pajamas like her parents claimed. Investigators believe that she had already been deceased for at least a month before her parents ever dialed 911. So the entire missing persons report, they believe it was a calculated cover-up. Both of her parents, Michilae Herring and Javeayah Harris, have been arrested and charged with homicide by child, and they both appeared before a judge today for their bond hearings, and the contrast was pretty wild. The father showed a little bit more visible emotion than the mother did, but I'm wondering if he's crying of real grief or because he's in panic about facing 20 years to life in prison. The judge also denied them both bond. He wouldn't be able to grant that anyway. They would have to appear in front of a circuit court judge, and they were both informed that they have to obtain their own attorney. They have to pay for private counsel because they make too much money for state-appointed attorneys.
That little baby Javeayah deserved to be here. She deserved a chance at life. She deserved to be around people that loved her, parents that loved and cared for her.
Hey,
What you want to say about the baby?
J-Time, baby.
Karen, you've been charged with homicide by child abuse. You understand that charge?
Yes, sir.
You understand that if convicted, it carries up 20 years to life in prison? You
Yes.
understand that?
There's a particular kind of dread that sets in when a search team realizes they've been looking in the wrong direction the entire time. Not the wrong physical direction, the wrong direction entirely. That's what happened in Aiken County, South Carolina, over the course of about a week in late June and early July. Hundreds of people spent days combing thousands of acres for a 4-year-old girl named Javeayah Harris, operating under one assumption: that somewhere out there she was still alive, still lost, still findable. What none of them knew, what investigators would only piece together later, is that the two people who set that search in motion had already known for weeks that there was nothing left in those woods to find. This is a story about a lie that worked exactly as well as its creators needed it to, for exactly as long as it took law enforcement to catch up to it. And it starts, like a lot of these stories do, with a phone call that never should have needed to happen. Let's put names to the people at the center of this. Johmarea Harris, 23. Michilae Herring, 22. A young couple, parents to a little girl named Javeayah, living in a modest home near Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road in Aiken County. If you'd passed either of them on the street a month before any of this became public, there'd have been nothing to notice, no warning signs visible to a stranger, no reputation in the community that would have made anyone raise an eyebrow. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it's true, in an uncomfortable number of these cases, the people capable of the worst things aren't always the people who look capable of them. Harris and Herring, by every outward account, were just two young parents in a small South Carolina county, doing whatever ordinary life looked like for them. Underneath that ordinary surface, though, something had already gone wrong, and had been wrong for far longer than anyone outside that house realized. Here's where I want to slow down, because the timeline in this case is the whole story. Everything that happened afterward, the search, the press conferences, the arrests, only makes sense once you understand how far apart the official timeline and the actual timeline turned out to be. According to the story initially given to authorities, Javeayah was last seen on the evening of June 30th, playing near the family's chicken coop while her mother kept watch from inside. 45 minutes later, she was gone. A search of the property turned up nothing. Family members looked, then neighbors. Then finally, law enforcement got the call. That's the timeline everyone believed for 4 days. It's also, according to investigators, not remotely close to what actually happened. Because here's the detail that changes everything once you know it. Sheriff Marty Sawyer would later stand in front of cameras and say that Javeayah had likely been dead for at least a month by the time that 911 call was made. Not missing for a month, dead. Which means whatever was happening in that house on June 30th, the panicked call, the description of a child playing by chickens, the appearance of a family in crisis, none of it was describing a real event. It was describing a performance, built around an absence that had existed for weeks already. So who was Javeayah Harris really, before all of this? That's the hardest part of this case to answer, and honestly it's the hardest part of almost every case like it. The victims in these stories rarely get remembered as people first. They get remembered as case files, full names attached to warrants, ages attached to charges, photographs attached to press releases. What we know is thin, and it's thin specifically because a 4-year-old doesn't leave much of a public record behind her. A name, Javeayah Harris. An age 4 years old, an address, a house in Aiken County. Most of her neighbors probably drove past 100 times without a second thought. What we can infer, though, is a little more troubling. If investigators are correct that she'd been dead for a month before anyone called for help, that means somewhere in the weeks leading up to her death, something had already gone catastrophically wrong inside that home, and nobody outside of it noticed. No teacher flagged anything because she likely wasn't old enough yet for school. No pediatrician raised concerns because, as we'll get into, there's reason to believe medical care had already stopped being part of the picture. No extended family member, no neighbor, no mandated reporter of any kind stepped in, because the entire situation was contained, deliberately or not, within 4 walls. That containment is the real background of this story. Not a specific incident, not a single dramatic moment, but an environment, a household where whatever was happening to Javeayah in her final weeks was allowed to happen without a single outside intervention. And that absence of intervention is exactly what makes the next part of this story so difficult to sit through. Because it means the adults who were supposed to be the last line of defense for a 4-year-old girl were, according to everything investigators would later uncover, the ones she needed defending from. Before we go further, ask yourself this: how does a household maintain that kind of isolation? How does a family close enough to have chickens in the backyard, close enough to have neighbors who'd later join a search effort for their daughter, manage to keep something this serious completely invisible for weeks? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, but it's the one worth holding on to as we move into what investigators say actually happened inside that house. Because the answer says a lot less about secrecy and a lot more about how easily silence can pass for normal life. According to arrest warrants, the injury that would ultimately end Javeayah's life happened weeks before that 911 call, during what investigators describe as an assault. Warrants point specifically to Michilae Herring's involvement in that incident. And what makes this section of the case so hard to categorize as planning, in any traditional sense, is that there doesn't appear to have been a plan at all, at least not initially. Just a moment where something went badly wrong, followed by a choice that would define everything that came after it. The choice to not get help. That choice is really the entire crime here, in a way that's almost harder to process than if this had been some calculated, premeditated act. There was no need for stealth, no need for a cover story yet, no need to plan anything, because the only thing required to let a child's injury go untreated is inaction. You don't need an alibi to not pick up the phone. You don't need to plan an excuse to not drive to an emergency room. The planning in this case, if we're being honest about what the word means here, was really just a decision to do nothing, made once, in a moment of crisis, and then remade every single day after that. The injury continued to go unaddressed. That's what should sit uncomfortably with anyone watching this. It's easy to imagine a criminal mastermind plotting something in the dark. It's much harder to imagine 2 ordinary young parents simply choosing, day after day, not to make one phone call that could have changed everything. But according to investigators, that's exactly what happened. No trip to urgent care, no call to Javeayah's pediatrician, no explanation offered to any family member who might have noticed something was wrong with her. Just silence, sustained over time, in a house where the 2 people responsible for protecting her instead protected themselves from the consequences of what they'd allowed to happen. Let's talk about what execution looks like in a case built entirely around inaction. Because there's no dramatic crime scene here in the way true crime often frames one. There's no elaborate cover-up unfolding in real time. What there is, according to warrants, is a stretch of days, maybe longer, where Javeayah was hurt, in pain, in a home where the adults who should have intervened simply let time pass instead. We don't have visibility into what those days actually looked like for her. That's part of what makes this case so quietly devastating. There's no witness account of her final weeks, no diary entry, no outside adult who checked in and could later describe what they saw. The silence that protected her parents from scrutiny is the same silence that erased any record of what Javeayah actually experienced in the time she had left. And then, according to Sheriff Sawyer's own public statements, somewhere in that unaddressed injury, in that sustained absence of care, Javeayah died roughly a month before anyone called to report her missing. Sit with the mechanics of that timeline for a second, because it's almost incomprehensible on its face. A month is not a blink. A month is weeks of mornings and evenings inside a household that, from the outside, looked exactly the same as it always had. A month where two people got up, functioned, interacted with neighbors, extended family, maybe even co-workers, all while carrying the knowledge of what had actually happened to their daughter. This is where the case shifts from tragic to calculated, because whatever indifference led to Javeayah's death, what came immediately after it required something different. It required decisions. According to investigators, Harris and Herring made the choice to dispose of her body somewhere outside Aiken County, entirely a decision that demanded logistics, not panic. A destination, a vehicle, distance, deliberately put between themselves and what had happened. Investigators would later focus search efforts in an area of interest tied to Fairfield and Chester counties. Well outside the county Javeayah had lived her entire short life in. That's not the behavior of two people improvising in the middle of a crisis. That's the behavior of two people trying to guarantee that whatever they'd done stayed buried, literally and figuratively, somewhere far enough away that it wouldn't be their problem to explain. And then, and this is the part of the story that I think says the most about how this entire thing unfolded, they went home. They went back to their lives in that same house near Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road, and continued on as if nothing about their daily existence had permanently changed. For weeks, neighbors saw them. Life continued around them in the mundane way it does in a small county. Errands, routines, whatever version of normal two people can construct when they're the only ones who know their daughter isn't in the house anymore. That's the real escalation in this case. It's not one explosive moment, it's a series of smaller choices, each one requiring the two of them to hold the line a little longer. Don't get help when she's hurt. Don't tell anyone when she dies. Take her somewhere far from home. Resume normal life. And eventually, when circumstances forced the question of where Javeayah actually was, construct a story simple enough to be believed and vague enough to survive a first round of scrutiny. A kid, some chickens, an unsupervised backyard, 45 minutes. That story held together for exactly as long as it took investigators to start testing it against reality. And that process, watching a fabricated missing child case quietly transform into a homicide investigation aimed squarely at the two people who reported it, is where we're headed next. For 4 days, Aiken County operated under one operating assumption: that Javeayah Harris was still out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. Sheriff Marty Sawyer gave daily updates. The FBI's Kevin Moore, out of the Columbia field office, talked about the scope of resources being poured into the case, dozens of agents, neighborhood canvassing, digital media review, specialized units including the behavioral analysis unit and the child abduction rapid deployment team. A helicopter searched from above. Drones covered terrain too dense to walk safely. Cadaver dogs worked the property line and the woods surrounding it. More than 200 people across local, state, and federal agencies converged on Aiken County with one shared objective. And the entire time, according to what investigators would later determine, that objective was already impossible. Here's the miscalculation at the heart of this case. And it's less about a single dramatic slip-up than about a basic misunderstanding of how modern investigations actually work. Michilae Herring's account of the evening was simple by design. A child playing near the chicken coop, out of sight for 45 minutes before anyone noticed. Simple stories are supposed to be harder to poke holes in, but simple only works if nobody's looking closely. And a missing child case involving the FBI guarantees that everybody is looking closely from multiple directions at once. Investigators don't take a timeline at face value. they rebuild it. Every detail Herring offered became something to test the exact sequence of who saw Javeayah last and when, whether the physical layout of the property made a 45-minute unsupervised window plausible, what phone activity showed during that window, what any neighbors or family members remembered independently of what they'd been told to expect. A story told once, under stress, to a 911 dispatcher rarely survives being cross-referenced against 4 days of forensic reconstruction, and this one didn't. But the timeline of June 30th wasn't actually the biggest problem for Harris and Herring. The bigger problem was the timeline before it. Because once investigators started examining the weeks leading up to that night, rather than just the night itself, an entirely different picture started to take shape. No medical records showing treatment for any injury. Inconsistencies in accounts of when people had actually last seen Javeayah alive and well, as opposed to when her parents claimed they had. Behavioral cues that a trained team specifically built to detect exactly this kind of thing is designed to catch. A missing persons case assumes a recent living presence. Once evidence started suggesting that assumption was false, the entire premise investigators had been operating under collapsed and had to be rebuilt from scratch, this time aimed at the two people who'd reported the disappearance in the first place. You can actually track this shift through the public record if you know what to look for. By July 3rd, ground search efforts had been scaled back. That's not a small detail. In cases like this, a shrinking physical search almost always means an expanding investigative one. Resources moving away from wooded terrain and toward interview rooms, subpoenaed records, digital forensics. The search hadn't stopped because hope had run out. It had stopped because the case had changed shape entirely, and searching a forest for a child investigators increasingly believed wasn't there anymore was no longer where the answers were going to come from. On July 4th, Sheriff Sawyer stood in front of reporters and delivered a statement he'd later describe as the hardest of his 36-year law enforcement career. He told the public that evidence led investigators to believe Javeayah was deceased, and that she had likely been dead for at least a month. His exact words that it was already too late to save her the moment that 911 call came in landed with a specific kind of weight, because it meant every hour of that 4-day search, every agent pulled off another assignment, every dog and drone and volunteer had been spent looking for a little girl who, according to authorities, had already been gone before the search ever started. Then came the arrests, announced in that same press conference. Javeayah Harris, 23, charged with homicide by child abuse. Michilae Herring, 22, charged with homicide by child abuse and, separately, with filing a false police report, a charge that exists specifically to name what her 911 call actually was, according to prosecutors. Not a grieving mother's cry for help, but the first move in an attempt to control a story that had already ended in tragedy weeks earlier. Both were denied bond during separate hearings held the following day, July 5th, and it was around this point that the most difficult detail in the entire case became public. Both parents, according to arrest warrants, had confessed, not just to filing a false report, but to the underlying truth the report had been built to hide. The injury, the failure to seek treatment, and what they did afterward, including disposing of Javeayah's body in a location authorities say sits outside Aiken County, with subsequent search efforts turning toward Fairfield and Chester counties. What's strange, if you sit with it, is how little resistance there apparently was once investigators had enough to confront them directly. No prolonged standoff, no drawn-out legal battle before the truth came out, just confessions, delivered once the fabricated version of events had nowhere left to hide. Which raises a question worth carrying into the next part of this story. What actually happens in that room? In that moment, when two people who've maintained a lie for a month finally decide the lie isn't worth maintaining anymore? Is it the evidence that breaks first? Or is it simply exhaustion, the sheer weight of carrying something like that, finally becoming heavier than the fear of what admitting it would cost them? When Sheriff Sawyer described what happened to Javeayah as showing extreme indifference to human life, he wasn't just reaching for a phrase that would land hard in front of cameras. That specific language matters under South Carolina law. Homicide by child abuse doesn't require prosecutors to prove that a caregiver set out intending to kill a child. It requires proving that a child died either as a direct result of abuse or as a result of a caregiver's extreme indifference to a life they were responsible for protecting, meaning someone who understood a child was in serious danger and chose with full awareness not to act. That appears to be exactly the theory this case is built on. Not that Javeayah Harris and Michilae Herring woke up one day intending to end their daughter's life, but that an injury occurred, that it went untreated for reasons still not fully explained publicly, and that the decision to withhold help was made with a level of conscious disregard the law treats as no less serious than intent. What that means practically is significant. Homicide by child abuse in South Carolina carries a mandatory sentence of 20 years to life. That's not a soft guideline prosecutors can negotiate away in some quiet plea arrangement. It's a flaw set by statute, specifically because the legislature decided cases where a caregiver is responsible for a child's death deserve that level of certainty. Layer on top of that the separate charge Herring faces for filing a false police report, which carries up to 5 additional years or a $5,000 fine, and you're looking at combined exposure that starts at 2 decades minimum and realistically extends toward the rest of both of their lives, depending on how the case resolves, with officials already signaling that more charges could still be added as the investigation continues. Neither Harris nor Herring has gone to trial as of the most recent public updates. Both were denied bond following their initial hearings, which means they're sitting in custody while prosecutors build the formal case that will eventually go before a judge, likely starting with indictment, then moving through the slower, more procedural stages that any homicide prosecution involving confessions and physical evidence has to pass through. Confessions carry serious weight with a jury, but they're rarely the whole case on their own. Prosecutors still need physical corroboration, which is a large part of why the search for Javeayah's remains was still active even after both parents were behind bars. Sheriff Sawyer made that point directly in his July 4th statement, saying the search for Javeayah drives on. Recovering her isn't only about giving her extended family somewhere to finally grieve, though that alone matters enormously. It's about giving prosecutors the forensic foundation that turns a confession into an airtight case confirmation of cause of death, a corroborated timeline, physical evidence that lines up with what Harris and Herring have already admitted to investigators. That's where this case currently sits. 2 confessed parents, a mandatory sentencing range waiting on the other side of a trial that hasn't started, and a 4-year-old girl whose body, based on everything publicly reported, still hadn't been recovered from wherever her parents chose to take her after deciding Aiken County wasn't far enough away. Now here's what I keep coming back to with this one, and it's not really about the crime itself, it's about the machine the crime accidentally triggered. 200 people searched for Javeayah Harris. A helicopter flew search patterns over Aiken County. Drones mapped ground too thick to walk through safely. Cadaver dogs worked property lines and tree lines for days straight. The FBI pulled specialized units, the Behavioral Analysis Unit, the Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, off whatever else they'd been working, and put them entirely on this one case. Local, state, and federal resources all pointed at a single goal: bring this little girl home. And for 4 full days, the 2 people who'd set that entire machine in motion understood something nobody else in that county did, that the machine would never succeed, because it had been built to search for something that no longer existed to be found. That's the part of this story that sits hardest with me. Every dollar spent, every hour donated by volunteer fire crews, every agent reassigned from another case, every ounce of hope a community poured into finding a missing child, all of it generated by 2 people who understood, with total clarity, exactly how effectively a missing child story mobilizes the world around it. They knew what that 911 call would trigger. That's precisely why they made it. What they apparently didn't account for is that the same machinery built to search outward into the woods is just as capable of turning inward toward the 2 people who called it into existence in the first place. An FBI behavioral analysis unit doesn't just study terrain, it studies people, timelines, the small inconsistencies that surface when something's being performed rather than lived. Every resource that lies summoned to Aiken County eventually became the exact instrument that unraveled it. The search built to protect their story instead dismantled it, piece by piece, until nothing was left standing but a confession neither of them could avoid giving. Sheriff Sawyer called it the hardest announcement of his career. Special Agent Kevin Moore called it heartbreaking that they weren't standing there with better news. Both meant it. But underneath that heartbreak is a colder truth this case leaves behind. The exact lie designed to protect two people from consequence is the thing that guaranteed they'd face it in full. Javeayah didn't get saved by that search. But in a way that feels both bitter and strangely fitting, she got something else from it. The machine her parents built to hide what happened to her ended up being the machine that found them. Please subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for our next daily uploads. Thank you.